Transitioning to a Trauma-Informed School by Melissa Flickinger, Concordia University, Portland. If you have been a part of the education world for any length of time, it becomes very clear that educators and administrators have very little control over what happens to students once they leave our schools and classrooms. But what has gained attention in recent years is how they affect teachers, caregivers, coaches, or any single person in a mentorship or leadership role can have a lasting impact on a child, especially one who has been exposed to trauma. As cited in Sowers and Hall, Rice and Groves define trauma as an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. In other words, the American Psychological Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster, and can also be said that it is really the experience or perception of these types of events that leaves one feeling hopeless, helpless, and powerless. Why is this important? Statistically speaking, based on a report from the National Survey on Children's Health, nearly 47% of all children in the United States have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, such as abuse, neglect, death of a parent, or witness to violence. And 22% of all children have two or more of these adverse childhood experiences, which makes them trauma victims. As these trauma-affected students come to our classes and schools each day, are we, as leaders in the education world, aware of how their traumatic experiences affect them? In fact, the higher the adverse childhood experience, or ACE, which will be discussed in the next slide, the more severe the effects. As stated in Sporletter and Forbes, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE study, is an ongoing research study that has shown a direct correlation between adverse childhood experiences and health and social problems as an adult. As further stated in Sporletter and Forbes, an ACE is defined as some of the most intense and frequently occurring sources of stress that children, birth to 18 years of age, might experience in life. Currently, there are 10 defined ACEs. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, loss of a parent, witnessing family violence, incarceration of a family member, having a depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal family member, living with a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member. Yes, as quoted in Sowers and Hall, what the initial ACE study did not cover was how the traumatic experiences immediately affected the child. This kind of information is crucial to educators if we are to provide them with the supports they need. For example, in subsequent research, there is a correlation between higher ACE scores and incidents of academic struggles. What researchers began to uncover was that trauma was impacting children immediately, and if not addressed or supported, could lead to an adult life full of emotional, physical, and mental health problems. As the ACE study has gained more recognition and clearly shown the direct correlation between ACE scores, especially high scores, to increased risk factors for disease, emotional and social problems as they enter adulthood. As Sporletter and Forbes have stated, the level of stressful experiences many students go through before they even enter their academic careers is on the rise. Their brains are being wired for fear, and the perception of the world is fear-based. Students, especially trauma-affected students, are no longer fitting in or functioning in the current educational environment. With the influx of this information, it is important to adjust the environment to meet kids where they are at. This goes against traditional practices, but traditional practices are not working. As an educator and a human being, I found it helpful and eye-opening to take the ACE quiz for myself. I was able to reflect on my score and look back at my behaviors and way of looking at life when I was a child, teenager, and young adult. My realizations were eye-opening. If only I would have had a school, a classroom, a teacher who understood the effects of trauma on the brain and how it manifests in different ways, I might have had the support I needed sooner. To take the ACE test, click the ACE quiz link. So what's the point? On the next slide, pediatrician Nadine Burke-Harris will explain the point in her TED Talk, which discusses how childhood trauma affects health across a lifetime. She seeks to find intervention and strategies, such as a trauma-informed school approach, to combat the effects and find early treatment for trauma-affected children. Click the link to watch How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime by pediatrician Nadine Burke-Harris. After listening to pediatrician Burke-Harris discuss the effects of trauma on not only the brain, but the developing immune system, developing hormone system, and even the way a child's DNA is read and transcribed, becomes more difficult and complex the older the child gets. Trauma that is so severe and pervasive can literally get under the skin and change a child's physiology. The picture shows a clear contrast between a healthy brain and an abused brain. As Burke-Harris suggested, there needs to be intervention early on in a child's life to minimize the effects. One way the educational world can do that is through a trauma-informed approach. To back up not only the point pediatrician Burke-Harris and the trauma-informed school approach offers trauma-affected children, Maslow's hierarchy of needs further supports the research and findings associated with trauma and its effects on people, in this case school-age children. It also shows this is not a new concept. As Mick Leod explains, Maslow compromised a 5-tier model of human needs in the 1940s. The model is in the shape of a pyramid and depicts the order of a person's needs and how they should be met in order for that person to reach its fullest potential. If you look closely at the pyramid, the physiological and safety needs make up the bottom of the pyramid. These needs are considered basic needs. If a child is coming to school fearful of his home or parents, threatened with starvation, and are feeling unsafe and not sure what to expect, this child will more than likely not be able to pay attention, pass tests, or meet academic expectations. This is where the trauma-informed school approach can be successful. As Forbes is quoted saying, "Creating a trauma-informed school isn't about teachers becoming therapists. It is about creating an environment that focuses on relationship, trust, and emotional safety, all of which anchor the 3 bottom sections of Maslow's pyramid." Instead of trying to address the top of the pyramid, as Sporleder and Forbes suggest, educators need to address the bottom and meet the social and emotional needs of the students. If a school can minimize the anxiety and additional stress a student is feeling, as a trauma-informed approach aims to do, it has been found to actually increase student success, engagement, and hope. The goal of a trauma-informed school is to develop more supportive academic environments that help youth manage stress and address the needs of at-risk youth to facilitate continued academic engagement, because an estimated 25% of youths in the general population have experienced a traumatic event, and being able to understand youth's responses to these challenges and having trauma-informed responses is essential for educators to maximize students' academic and emotional potential, as cited in Pickens and T-Shop. As a school looks to transition to a trauma-informed approach, there are 5 crucial areas that need specific focus. First, a shift in perspective. Secondly, full commitment by staff and administration. Next, the campus must move from a fear-based campus to a relationship-based campus. 4, learning how to stay regulated and respond rather than react, especially as the adult. And finally, looking at changes in discipline. All of these areas will be discussed further in the subsequent slides. One of the first orders of business when transitioning to a trauma-informed approach is having a shift in perspective, especially by all staff, teachers, and administration. To begin, Sowers and Hall suggest viewing every student as though he or she has experienced trauma or is exposed to chronic stress. A school and individual members of the school have to stop focusing on the behavior of the kids and labeling them as difficult, lazy, and hopeless. Instead, they must view them through a trauma-exposed lens and understand, as Sporleder and Forbes state, it is a brain issue, not a behavioral issue. And by understanding the why behind the behaviors, schools, teachers, and staff can begin to foster a safe and secure environment. The key to a true perspective change is willingness. Sporleder and Forbes remind us that getting school staff and teachers to change how they think, act, and respond to students will take conscious effort and dedication. As stated in the previous slide, it takes 100% commitment from administration, and along with their commitment, a school leadership team needs to be formed to provide support to teachers and staff through the implementation process. The leadership team should include as many staff and teachers the administration deems necessary, but all of those members should be completely committed to the trauma-informed model. While not all staff will buy in right away, because the fear of change can be overwhelming, it is important to continue to support and encourage the staff that has taken a little longer to buy into the process. The traditional practices have been ingrained in educators, and academics has always been the most important aspect. But as the pressures of life continue to affect children, the focus must be on the social and emotional needs before the academic achievement can be reached. The trauma-informed model is a top-down approach, as Sporlietter and Forbes describe. The administrator is the catalyst, and the main office is ground zero and the foundation of the implementation process. The main office staff and the leadership team must commit to the implementation process and must support, listen, and be understanding to any staff members who are resisting the changes. Over time, as the new approach begins to change the overall climate of the school, the hope 100% of staff and teachers will be on board. One of the most important aspects of the trauma-informed school is moving from a fear-based approach to a relationship-based approach, as illustrated by Sporlietter and Forbes. Sowers and Hall suggest that students who have a strong connection with a caring adult and who are a part of a consistent and unconditional environment that demonstrates love and forgiveness, while at the same time holds strong boundaries and expectations, like a trauma-informed approach aims to be, has a chance to overcome the harmful effects of trauma and build resiliency and coping skills. One of the common characteristics of a trauma-affected student, as illustrated by Pickens and Teashop, is their lack of trust in adults. This can make it difficult to form healthy relationships. Hand in hand with building a relationship is building trust and safety first, which, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is the basic needs of a person. The student must feel safe and trust the adult in order to build any type of relationship. Things like consistency, healthy and positive interactions, clear expectations, and follow-through are all strategies to building healthy, trusting connections with students. As Sowers and Hall state, educators need to find a way to cultivate strong, meaningful connections and earn the trust of students. Yet relationships are a two-way street. Educators can't expect students to have faith and trust in them if they don't give them the same thing. The trauma-informed approach teams educators and students together in a way that will create a lasting mark on these students, otherwise, who would have been thrown to the wayside. Sporlietter and Forbes have pointed out that trauma-affected students are already living in a mode of flight, fight, or flee. When the adult is not able to stay regulated when approaching a student who is dysregulated, the outcome will be to escalate the student to their breaking point. This requires a perspective shift, as stated before. One of the ways teachers and educational staff members can begin to change their perspective is by viewing every student as though he or she has experienced trauma or is exposed to chronic stress. With this perspective in mind, learning to respond will take some time getting used to because it is very different from traditional methods. Something you can always ask yourself when dealing with a student who seems to be escalating or whose behavior is less than par is, am I responding to the student as a person or am I reacting to his behavior? If staff members at a trauma-informed school shift their perspective and look at students with empathy and as human beings, the way they will respond to them will change over time as they learn to respond in loving responses instead of traditional reactions. When a teacher feels themselves reacting, it is important for them to have a way to de-escalate themselves before working further with the student. They do not want to damage the relationship further by reacting to the behavior and not responding to the needs of the student, which is the reason for the behavior. Switching from, you need to take ownership, a traditional response, to, I'm sorry this is so hard, a trauma-informed response, will take time, but with dedication and a mindset that the student is facing difficulties, it can happen. Not only is there a perspective shift when viewing students through a trauma-informed lens, but there is also a shift from traditional discipline or punitive consequences to teachable moments and opportunities to help students make better or different choices in the future. For some, it will be hard to not punish students for negative behavior. However, it is not a model without consequences and boundaries, as Sporlietter and Forbes state. It is more about the delivery of the consequence and guiding students to corrective action. Punitive punishments defeat the relationship-based culture the trauma-informed model aims to create. When discipline is delivered in a loving way with forgiveness and understanding and corrective behavior suggestions, it builds connections and gives students a chance to correct their behavior in the future. Things like in-school suspension instead of at-home suspension, student concern worksheets, check-in, check-out, and the use of the school resource officer will begin to establish an environment of accountability and expectation, but also of love and forgiveness. Something to remember as you transition to a trauma-informed school, as stated by Sparliater and Forbes, is that there is no perfect model of a trauma-informed school without its own unforeseen challenges. But the answers will come when you are looking through the lens of trauma and unconditional love. It will take being consistent and creating an unconditional environment that demonstrates love and forgiveness, while at the same time holds strong boundaries and expectations. While we may not be able to reverse all the effects of trauma on the students we serve, we can provide them with a chance at resiliency and a place of trust and love that will hopefully help them learn to cope and handle their feelings and emotions while being academically successful.